Live to see it, friends, and welcome to the World Transformed. My name is Phil Bowermaster, and with me in the virtual studio is my co-host, Stephen Gordon. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, Phil, how are you?
Well, I am super fantastic. How are you, my friend?
Man, I am looking forward to tonight's show. We do these serious shows sometimes that we really delve into serious topics, but occasionally we reward ourselves, right, with just fun stuff, and that's what tonight's all about.
We like to geek out once in a while, and because it's our show and there's no one who can tell us we can't, we do it. There it is. I was explaining to my kids the other day that they were talking to their mother about her job and who her boss is, and then they suddenly had this weird thought like, well, Daddy, who's your boss? And I'm like, well, I'm actually my boss. And my son thinks about that for a minute, and he goes, well, could you fire yourself? And I said, yeah, but I'd probably just quit, before it came to that.
You'd say to yourself in the mirror, you can't fire me, I quit.
That's exactly right. You could take this job and shove it. Exactly. That's how that would go down right there. But all that's to say, we're the bosses here, so we like to geek out. We're gonna geek out. And we got a few fun, geeky topics tonight. First off, I want to talk about how historical fiction is merging with a brand new genre that I'm going to call historical fantasy. And I think it's actually something that's just emerging now. And I don't think it existed before. Maybe it did. Probably there's been some fiction books written that follow this trend, but it's something I've observed from two TV shows that I enjoy quite a bit. One is Vikings on History Channel, and the other one is Frankenstein Chronicles, which is currently showing on Netflix. Vikings, have you ever watched Vikings, Stephen?
No, I have not. Tell me about it. What's that all about?
It's a pretty good show. Check it out when you get a chance. But it lives up to the name. It's about Vikings, and it takes their story right around the 9th, 10th century, right at the period when they really started heading west rather than east. You know, for a long time they were working into Russia, and then suddenly they start going the other way and they hit Britain. And then they discover the rest of Europe, and the rest is history. You know, they had a huge impact on the history of Europe. Well, what the show does is it brings several different generations of characters together as though they were all contemporaries, right? So these two guys are brothers. They weren't really brothers. I don't think they even lived in the same country, but they were both really significant. One was like the first guy who ever raided England. The other guy is the guy who ended up in France and became ultimately the Duke of Normandy and like the great-grandfather of William the Conqueror. Okay, so it kind of really started the whole Norman invasion thing. So these guys are brothers, and their friend who builds their ship is actually the guy who I'm sorry, these are mild spoilers, not historical spoilers if you know these people's names, but they are spoilers on the TV show. Anyway, goes on and discovers Iceland, right? So it's like all these guys know each other, even though in real life they lived hundreds of years apart, and there's no way they knew each other. They couldn't possibly have met. So that is a trope anyway. I mean, that's been done in historical fiction before. Shakespeare would do that sort of thing, right? He would mix people from different times and bring them together.
And various anachronisms, that writers will sometimes put into. It doesn't necessarily, just because you got one or two anachronisms in a work of fiction, doesn't necessarily turn it into historical fantasy, but it's a step in that direction.
Right, but they've added a layer, which is there is a character in Vikings who's their seer, and he predicts the future. And darned if the guy isn't spot on, right? I mean, sometimes he makes these like Oracle of Delphi predictions, and it's like either way he says it, right? I mean, either way, whatever happens, there's a way of phrasing the thing he said such that it turns out to be true. So that's like he's very clever. But then increasingly, it's like you can see this guy actually does see the future. And then there's a scene where a major character dies, and basically Odin shows up and tells everybody, this guy has died. So at some point it crosses this boundary where it's no longer just historical fiction. It's working these supernatural, these fantastical elements into it, just subtly. There's not a lot of it. There's just a little bit of it going on, enough to where you could say, well, this was just kind of their beliefs. But it's being shown as though it really happened. And I think, well, that's really cool. This is like historical fantasy. There's enough history in there to get you interested in history, so you can go read a real book about Vikings and learn something. But it's also got these kind of fantastic elements that make it a fun Game of Thrones kind of a TV show. So if you haven't watched Vikings, it's definitely worth a look. I'm sure it's on either Netflix or Amazon. And then the other show that falls into that same category is Frankenstein Chronicles, which is really fun because it's taken the Frankenstein story and made it sort of historical. Okay, not exactly, but sort of. The great thing about it is it's got a fictional story going on, but real people are in it, right? So you've got Mary Shelley is in it, and William Blake, and Ada Lovelace is in it. And there's a character who I believe must be Charles Dickens, although they haven't called him that yet. And it's the same thing. They're not the right ages, right? If you look at when they were alive, it's like, well, if Mary Shelley's this age, then Charles Dickens should be like 10, right? But it's okay. They're both adults, and they're all existing at the same time. And all this Frankenstein stuff is going on, right? So it's just awesome.
With the idea that Mary Shelley witnesses this, and then she writes her book.
Basically, yeah. That she wasn't just inspired by this guy who lived 300 years ago named, I think it was Johann Dippel, who lived in Castle Frankenstein, to write this fictional story. Dippel is a real guy. I mean, he's a contemporary in this version of it, and she knew his son, and his son was actually doing all this stuff. Right? so she writes it down. It's very cool. If you get a chance, check out Frankenstein Chronicles. I can't recommend it highly enough. And Sean Bean is in it. And 2 seasons in, he's still going strong. So, if you're worried about Sean Bean dying, I'm just going to...
The thing that comes to mind is pretty much the whole genre of what-if fiction it would fall into that. And what I mean is it could be considered a form of science fiction writing.
Yes.
But what if, let's say, Babbage had completed his analytical engine, which was which is a full mechanical computer, but it was a full computer, fully programmable, and of course Ada Lovelace would have been there programming it, right?
Yep.
And what if he'd actually been able to complete that, and the information age would have arrived 100 years earlier? There have been whole series of science fiction novels on that premise, with basically kind of a steampunk, kind of Victorian information age kind of flavor.
Oh, for sure. And alternate history is a well-established genre. This is slightly different because it's more like this is a horror story / history, right? It's like it's fantasy.
What you're describing is actually, you don't have to say this is a different stream of history, a different that can't be our past. What you're describing is a fantasy that you have the idea that this could be our past if you buy these fantastical elements, right?
Right. It's like a slightly different version of our past that has the fantastical elements in it, and it's
right. So
it's good fun
stuff, man. Yeah.
I'm enjoying it a lot. I recommend both those shows. And speaking of things you recommend, I assume you're going to tell us that we should go see Ready Player One. Is that right?
Ready Player One, Phil. We've discussed the novel on this show, and very much enjoyed the novel. I laughed and said that when I described it, said, it's a really good thing I read this, because Ernest Cline, I think, basically said to himself, well, what kind of novel should I write if I'm trying to please Stephen Gordon, right? And
most authors should think, by the way. I think more authors should go about that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Weir kind of did that with The Martian. That was pretty much right at my alley.
There you go.
But Ready Player One, it was all the geeky things I loved as a kid and still love, shoved into a science fiction dystopia, but it was, a fun dystopia, okay? Just a fun book. Well, now Ready Player One, the story was taken by Steven Spielberg, and Ernest Cline, by the way, was involved in the writing of the screenplay. He was not the only writer of the screenplay, but he was an important
Hollywood. So you know how that works. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Sure.
So he took his own story that was the novel and adapted it for the screen. And here's the thing, Phil. I don't want to get into a spoiler-filled breakdown of how the novel is different from the movie. I will just say this: it is, in broad brushstrokes, the same story as the novel. But because they couldn't use practically very few of the same IPs could be used, so they got the IPs they could get, many of which are nods to Steven Spielberg's stuff anyway, right?
Right.
So they got those things, and so all the puzzles practically in the entire movie are different from the puzzles that were in the novel that get you to the same place at the end.
Oh,
okay.
Well, you know what? You have to be a real inside baseball Dungeons and Dragons player for those puzzles to be meaningful anyway, right? I mean, so...
And some of the...
so as long as they're good, that's okay, right? I mean, as long as they're...
Right, and of course, and so you don't... And so some of the things, like Dungeons and Dragons, are moved from major plot points, as they were in the novel, to just they kind of tip their hat to it. There's a couple of marquees that show Dungeons and Dragons and a couple of other things, and so but instead they're using other stuff.
It's hard for me to picture that story without Dungeons and Dragons.
There's very little Dungeons and Dragons in it.
Wow.
They're using different IPs altogether, different puzzles altogether. So you can have memorized the book, Phil, and then go see this movie and be fresh and unspoiled on practically every point by point going through.
Okay, well, I got to ask two things. I got two questions, okay?
Right.
Joust?
Joust makes, there's a battle in it, and you see a lot of people participating in the battle, and one of them is a knight on an ostrich.
Okay. That's as close as we get to Joust. Okay. Question two,
which is very different from what it was in the
absolutely.
I mean,
they play Joust in the book. Absolutely.
Right.
Okay. Question two, war games?
No war games at all.
Yeah.
But you will not be upset.
But they haven't gutted it. You're saying they've pulled these things out, but it's still the same story.
Yeah, you'll not be upset because there's a different movie, Phil, that just absolutely blew me away. I was laughing, and it's just great. It's just great.
Okay.
I walked out of there. The typical geek thing is, well, that was nothing like the book. That sucked. No, not at all. Not at all. It was very different and very awesome, also.
Okay.
And I loved it, and I highly recommend it. Whether you certainly don't need to have read the book to understand what's going on, because the book is not going to help you much, and nor will you be disappointed if you enjoyed the book, because they're still telling the same story but with different puzzles. And so you go in almost unspoiled because of that, whether you've enjoyed the book or not. So
fair enough. All right, I'm going to check out Ready Player One. And you know what? I'm far enough away that I don't remember all the details from the book anyway, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, I got one more quick geek recommendation. The series Counterpart on Starz, also available on Amazon Prime if you're an Amazon Prime member. I watched the first episode. I know that the first season just wrapped last Sunday night, so it's still pretty fresh. And J.K. Simmons is in it. Not to give too much away, but it's about a guy who meets a version of himself from a parallel universe, and I got to say, it's worth checking out. Okay, if you got a few minutes, check out Counterpart on Starz.
So it's on Starz, but also this particular show on Starz has been brought into Amazon Prime. So.
It's available on Amazon Prime. So check if you like that kind of thing. And to me, it's interesting because it's kind of set up as a spy thriller, and there's all this intrigue going on between the two worlds. But what's really interesting is here you got two versions of the same person. How and why are they different? And it really is interested in that, and it explores that, and it's great fun. So something I would highly recommend.
Well, I've got another Amazon Prime recommendation. Blade Runner 2049 is on Amazon Prime, and we did a whole show, Phil, talking about Blade Runner 2049.
One of our big movies for 2017, absolutely.
Yep, it was artsy and difficult in the best kind of way. It's a challenging. It's not your typical sci-fi kind of thing. It's
very surprising, visually stunning movie. I can't say enough good things about that movie. Good stuff. All right, so it's available, folks. If you haven't seen it yet, I believe we both recommended it months ago, so you have no excuses left. It's time to check that one out. All right. Well, that's it, Stephen. You know what? We have wrapped up another week. Can you believe that? And we're going to have to come back and do the same thing next week. We'll be back next week with 3 brand new shows. It's been great talking with you, Stephen. It's been great having you all with us. And until next time, live to see it.